Where Eagles Dare is one of the greatest action films ever made, but the story of how it got made is almost as insane as the plot. Blizzards, disappearing stars, stuntmen losing teeth, an actress who survived a real concentration camp, and a castle that was actually a police academy. What happened behind the camera is as wild as anything on screen. Fact 1. The entire film was Richard Burton's son's idea. The reason Where Eagles Dare exists at all begins not with a producer, a studio, or a screenwriter, but with a child who wanted to see his father in an adventure film. Richard Burton's son had grown tired of watching his father in prestige dramas and asked him to make something exciting. Burton approached producer Elliot Kastner, who then went to Alistair MacLean. At the time, every MacLean novel had already been sold or filmed. Kastner persuaded MacLean to write something entirely new. 6 weeks later, MacLean delivered a script. One Boy's Wish for a Different Kind of Film led directly to one of the most celebrated action movies of the 1960s. Fact 2. MacLean wrote the script and the novel at the same time. Alistair MacLean had never written a screenplay before Where Eagles Dare, and he approached the challenge in a way that was either brilliant or completely insane. He wrote the script and the novel simultaneously, working on both versions of the same story at the same time over 6 weeks. Because of this, the film follows the book more faithfully than almost any other MacLean adaptation before or since. Both were finished together, both were published and released together, and both became major commercial successes. A first-time screenwriter delivered one of the tightest action scripts of the decade, while also writing the book it was based on, because there was no original book yet when he started. Fact 3. Eastwood hated the script and gave all his lines to Burton. Before a single camera rolled, Clint Eastwood had already decided that most of what was written for his character was wrong. He read the MacLean screenplay and described it privately as terrible. All exposition and complications. His solution was to strip Schaffer down to almost nothing. Most of the dialogue originally assigned to Eastwood was quietly transferred to Richard Burton, while Eastwood retained almost all of the action. Director Brian Hutton recognized the logic immediately and played to both actors' strengths. Burton's theatrical background gave Smith the speeches, and Eastwood's silent intensity gave Schaffer every gun in the castle. The division made the film significantly better than the script Eastwood had called terrible. Fact 4. Eastwood demanded equal billing and got $800,000. Clint Eastwood was not the automatic choice for the film, and he knew exactly what his presence was worth. When the role of Schaffer was offered to him, Eastwood was reluctant to accept second billing below Richard Burton, who at the time was one of the most celebrated actors in the world. The negotiations concluded with Eastwood receiving $800,000, compared to Burton's $1,200,000, and a deal that included one unusual perk. MGM agreed to deliver a brand new Norton P11 motorcycle as part of his contract. Eastwood accepted the terms, took the motorcycle, and then immediately broke the insurance clause by taking it to Brands Hatch Racetrack to test it, accompanied by his co-star Ingrid Pitt, strictly against producers' orders. Fact 5. The role was also offered to Lee Marvin, who turned it down. Before Clint Eastwood was approached for the role of Schaffer, the part was offered to Lee Marvin, who had just come off a string of major hits, including The Dirty Dozen, released the previous year. Marvin declined, reportedly telling the producers they were about 4 years too late. Richard Burton himself had a different casting preference. He had specifically wanted Richard Egan for the American role, someone whose background felt more naturally suited to a military part. Neither Marvin nor Egan got the part. The role went to Eastwood, and what he brought to it, the silence, the lethal efficiency, the absolute economy of movement, was something neither of the preferred alternatives would have provided. Fact 6. Richard Burton was drinking up to 4 bottles of vodka a day. Richard Burton arrived in Austria in January 1968 in the grip of one of the most destructive periods of his drinking. Ingrid Pitt, who played Heidi, said Burton was drinking very heavily throughout production, deeply depressed about the deteriorating state of his marriage to Elizabeth Taylor and his growing sense that his career was in decline. Reports from the set described Burton consuming up to 4 bottles of vodka a day. He disappeared for several days during production and was eventually found carousing with Peter O'Toole, Oliver Reed, Trevor Howard, and Richard Harris, a gathering of some of the heaviest drinkers in the British film industry, none of whom apparently felt any urgency about returning to work. The producer's response was simply, "We don't need you, we need him." Fact 7. Burton used a hidden crane to climb the castle walls. One of the most striking visual details in the film is the way Burton and Eastwood scale the sheer walls of the fortress. And the contrast between the two men tells a story that audiences never knew. Burton moves across the wall with apparent ease, smooth and unhurried. Eastwood, younger and in far better physical condition, is visibly exerting himself and working hard. The reason is that Burton, already out of shape from years of drinking and at this point physically incapable of actually climbing the wall, had arranged to be carried up by a crane that was rendered invisible in post-production by special effects. The fit young American was genuinely climbing. The legendary Welsh actor was riding a hidden machine while appearing to scale a mountain fortress. The crane was never mentioned in any press material. Fact 8. The castle was a real Austrian police academy. The Schloss Adler, the apparently impregnable Alpine fortress at the center of the film, does not exist. But the building that played it does, and at the time of filming, it was being used for a purpose that made the production slightly complicated to arrange. The location is Hohenwerfen Castle in Werfen, Austria, an 11th century fortress perched on a peak in the Alps that was in active use as a police training camp when the production arrived in January 1968. Producer Elliot Kastner had to negotiate permission to use a working law enforcement facility as a set for a film about a Nazi mountain stronghold. The film's geography places the castle in Bavaria, but the fortress itself, the mountain, and the surrounding landscape are entirely Austrian, and every approaching shot is the real approach to a real castle. Fact 9. The stuntman who jumped between moving cable cars lost 3 teeth. The cable car sequence is the most celebrated action scene in the film, and it came close to being a fatal one. The critical jump between 2 moving cable cars, suspended hundreds of feet above an alpine gorge, was performed by British stuntman Alf Joint, who doubled for Richard Burton throughout the film. The jump had been planned to be filmed on location using the real cable car system in Salzburg, but after Yakima Canutt assessed the situation at the real location, watching the cable car pass its speed, he judged it unworkable and redesigned the sequence around a full-scale model back in London. Even with those modifications, Joint lost 3 teeth during the filming of the sequence. The man who completed the most dangerous stunt in the film also played Capungo, the man James Bond electrocutes in the bathtub in the Goldfinger opening. Fact 10. Yakima Canutt was pulled out of retirement to direct the action. The man responsible for designing and executing almost every action sequence in Where Eagles Dare was not a young specialist hired for a single film. He was a Hollywood legend who had been effectively retired. Yakima Canutt, the stuntman and second unit director whose career stretched back to the silent era, and who had staged the chariot race in Ben-Hur, was brought out of retirement specifically for this production. Producer Elliot Kastner overruled every objection from his partners, insisting that Canutt was simply the best. The stunts Canutt designed and executed in the Austrian Alps in January 1968, under conditions of blizzard, sub-zero temperatures, and genuine avalanche risk, set new standards for large-scale action filmmaking that remained benchmarks for the following decade. Fact 11. Ingrid Pitt was a real concentration camp survivor. The actress who plays the defiant barmaid Heidi, flashing signals to the commandos while surrounded by German officers, was not performing courage she had only imagined. Ingrid Pitt, born Ingushka Petrov in Poland, had spent 3 years of her childhood imprisoned in Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig before escaping with her mother. She later also escaped over the Berlin Wall. Filming Where Eagles Dare, surrounded by actors in Nazi uniforms, was, by her own account, genuinely difficult. The costumes were not costumes to her in the way they were to everyone else on set. Her presence in the film gives it a layer of authentic gravity that no amount of research or preparation could have replicated. The woman playing a resistance operative had lived a version of exactly that story as a child. Fact 12. An SS uniform caused a baron to faint on the street. Darren Nesbitt, who plays the suspicious and menacing Gestapo Major von Hoppen, was so committed to authenticity that he requested a meeting with a former member of the Gestapo to understand the correct military bearing and regalia. That meeting was arranged. What was not arranged was an encounter that occurred while Nesbitt was in full SS uniform near the set. He walked past a baron who recognized the uniform. Recognized it with the kind of physical recognition that bypasses reason, and the man fainted on the spot. It emerged that the baron had been Heinrich Himmler's personal driver. The Jewish Chronicle later called Nesbitt to ask how he could play a German. His reply, "I play them very badly." That seemed to satisfy them. Fact 13. The director was secretly making a James Bond film. Brian Hutton, the director, had a personal philosophy about Where Eagles Dare that he kept largely to himself while making it, but shared openly afterwards. "To me it was a big spoof," he said. "A war picture played like a James Bond fantasy." While the studio and producers were presenting the film as a serious espionage thriller, Hutton was directing it as an exercise in high-concept escapism. The Bond formula applied to World War II, with impossible missions, beautiful agents, elaborate villain headquarters, and a hero who dispatches enemies with mechanical precision and complete emotional detachment. Audiences responded to exactly the film Hutton intended to make. Even though that film was never described honestly in any of its marketing, the film critics reviewed is not quite the film Hutton was making. Fact 14. Eastwood kills more people in this film than in any other. Clint Eastwood built his career on screen violence. The spaghetti westerns, Dirty Harry, the outlaw Josie Wales, but none of them match the body count he achieves as Lieutenant Schaffer. By the end of Where Eagles Dare, Eastwood's character has killed more people on screen than in any other single Eastwood film before or since. The producers and director tracked this explicitly and were quietly proud of it. It is a measure of how completely the film commits to its own premise. The mission requires the elimination of effectively the entire German garrison of the fortress, and Schaffer handles most of it personally, with a Thompson submachine gun and a quality of unhurried lethality that suggests he could keep going indefinitely. Dirty Harry had a six-shooter. Schaffer had an ammunition supply that appears to have no theoretical limit. Fact 15. The aerial dogfight used Swiss Air Force planes pretending to be German. The authenticity of the aviation sequences in Where Eagles Dare rests on a quiet deception that would have been impossible in almost any other country. The Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft used to fly the commandos into Austria and escape at the end of the film was a real Swiss Air Force Ju-52/3M, registration A702, borrowed from the Swiss military for the production. The T-6 Texan trainer aircraft used to pose as German fighters pursuing the transport were also Swiss Air Force planes. Switzerland lent its operational military aircraft to a film about a World War II Allied mission, while flying those planes in German markings. The specific Ju-52 used in the film was later destroyed in a real accident on August 4, 2018 in Switzerland, killing all 20 people on board. Fact 16. A squib nearly blinded the Gestapo villain. The scene in which Darren Nesbitt's Major von Hoppen is shot was nearly the last scene anyone filmed anything with him. Squib technology, the small explosive charges used to simulate bullet impacts on actors, was still relatively new and imprecise in 1968. During the filming of his death scene, the squibs positioned on Nesbitt's chest malfunctioned and discharged upward rather than outward, driving the explosive force directly toward his face. Nesbitt was almost blinded. The take was unusable. The death scene was recut to show only a single headshot rather than the intended chest and head combination. And the near miss left everyone on set considerably more cautious about squib placement for the remainder of the production. The entire sequence appears in the finished film running only a few seconds. Fact 17. The film was shot in blizzards with a crew of 300. The production team that arrived in Salzburg on January 2, 1968, was over 300 people strong, and they arrived in the worst possible conditions. The Austrian Alps in early January brought blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, unpredictable high winds, roads made impassable by snow and ice, and a constant threat of avalanche on the mountain approaches to the castle location. The crew had approximately 6 hours of usable daylight each day. Every piece of equipment, every camera position, every stunt setup had to be built, used, and broken down within those conditions and within that window. The production ran from January through July 1968, 6 months for a film that takes place in what appears to be a single night, because the conditions in winter Austria demanded it. Fact 18. Elizabeth Taylor visited the set, and Burton still disappeared. The presence of Elizabeth Taylor on the set of Where Eagles Dare was intended to provide a stabilizing influence on her husband's behavior. It did not work. Taylor visited Burton during production, her arrival generating the kind of attention from press and onlookers that tended to follow her everywhere. And Burton's drinking and disappearances continued regardless. Back at the Elstree studio stages in England, the situation was no better. Ingrid Pitt recalled Burton hosting marathon lunch sessions in a thatched barn at Borehamwood, to which he would invite Peter O'Toole, Robert Shaw, and other friends, and which would reliably transform into all-afternoon drinking events. The studio's response to losing Burton to these sessions was not disciplinary. It was to carry on with whatever shooting could be completed without him and wait. Fact 19. Steven Spielberg called it his favorite war film of all time. Where Eagles Dare has a defender of almost absurd credibility in its corner. Steven Spielberg, who made Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Empire of the Sun, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, has named Where Eagles Dare as his personal favorite war film, specifically for what he called its sheer boy's own factor of unreality. In a Channel 4 survey of the top 100 war films, Spielberg was so committed to his choice that he went further and spontaneously quoted the film's most famous radio communication line, broadsword calling Danny Boy. A director responsible for some of the most morally serious and cinematically rigorous war films in history chose as his personal favorite a film whose hero kills more Nazis in 2.5 hours than most Allied divisions managed in a year. Fact 20. The film saved Richard Burton's career. Where Eagles Dare was not simply a commercial success for Richard Burton, it was a rescue operation. By 1968, Burton's career had declined badly from the heights of the early 1960s. Reviewers were writing about his decline. Major studios were no longer offering him the leading roles he had once commanded. The film he made as a favor to his son's wish for an adventure movie became the biggest box office success of his later career, and the most financially rewarding, as his deal included royalties from television repeats and video sales that continued paying him for years. Burton himself later called the film a humdinger. The man Time magazine said had been reduced to playing cardboard parts turned out to have made the film that defined the genre. He was never quite as commercially bankable again afterwards, but this one proved he still had it.